Oh,
Okay, so hello. So this is another. People have started calling them podcasts. I'm afraid. I was thinking of them as lectures, conversations, online conversations, but I guess that's part of the definition of a podcast. And this is principally for my BA module called Body Image. And this week, in the final week or the final 2 weeks of the module, had we been doing face-to-face lectures in real time, I was going to do a lecture on two different kinds of lecture on the relationship of deconstruction and or to or with or in relation to or through or beside the body, and images of the body, obviously for this module, body image. So I have got understandings of deconstruction, but I mean Jacques Derrida, kind of the biggest name connected with deconstruction, wrote a great deal, and his work was taken up in very many different ways. I've taken up deconstruction mainly as a way of pulling things to pieces. I wrote a book called Deconstructing Popular Culture. My most recent book was called Deconstructing Martial Arts, in which I use the kind of what I understand to be the conceptual organization of deconstruction to analyze things, issues, identities in popular culture. But today I invited my friend and former colleague, Dr. Richard Stamp from Bath University, to kind of bounce ideas off, because we often agree, but we often kind of have very different understandings of things. So Richard, hello, thank you for coming.
hello, Paul. Hello, everybody. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. I want to start off by asking what you thought about my initial invitation to talk about the relationship between deconstruction and the body. I mean, what was the first thing that kind of leapt to mind?
Well, obviously, first and foremost, given my particular nature and personality, fear. Fear was above all my first reaction to almost everything. And then, obviously, the thing that struck me was, and I remember this from various kind of very critical responses to Derrida's work throughout the decades, in fact. And that is, well, where do you find the body in deconstruction? Where do you find Derrida explicitly addressing the body in the sense that one could think about a whole number of other philosophers and thinkers and theorists who are very much involved in thinking through the body and in terms of its materiality. And one of the, let's call it classical, I'm sorry, I'm going to stop doing bunny ears for things like that, or the precautionary condoms of quotation marks, as Derrida calls them in his that great interview on the rhetoric of drugs. One of those classical criticisms of Derrida and deconstruction is that he doesn't address the material conditions of whatever it is, that textuality and the primacy of the concept of the text in deconstruction leaves no room for or is abstracted from questions of the body. And my precautionary classical is that obviously those criticisms are, well, largely based on a non-reading of Derrida's text, or perhaps missing the body in the text of deconstruction. Okay. So my first thought when you asked me was, well, where do I go and find it? And I know you'd already suggested, well, hauntology, the notion of spectrality of the ghost as a kind of repeated motif, particularly in later Derrida's work, but it's, as he himself points out, you can trace it all the way back to his earliest books. But the text that immediately came to mind was one, I think, of the very first I read as an undergraduate, just about to start graduate studies and getting slightly fascinated and overexcited about Derrida's work, which I kind of discovered at that point. And aside from things like of grammatology, I read this very strange short text, which I thought, sure, it's going to be easy, called Timpan, at the beginning of Margins of Philosophy, published in the, I don't know whether it was published earlier, but I think it was simply published as a kind of preface to that particular text. And of course, the timpan and the tympanum is about the ear. It's about the inner organs and the inner working and the very material aspects, the bodily, corporeal aspects of the phenomenon of hearing. And so I think the traces of Derrida's very long-standing engagement with the body and questions of deconstruction, of inside, outside, of meaning and sense and of hearing. Of course, in French, the verb entendre means to hear, as well as to mean, to intend. S'entendre parler was something that one of the first bits of French I learned, I think, in terms of figuring that out.
Because the thing that always got me with deconstruction was the way that it would. I mean, one of the first deconstructive terms that when I understood what a deconstructive operation was to invert and displace, right? Mm-hmm. So what does Derrida do? He inverts and displaces. And what does that mean? Well, one of the first things that I thought about in that respect was the idea that what is most inner to me, what is inside me, is always in some sense external as well. It's kind of social. Like what is most intimate to me can be looked at by a sociologist and go, aha, that's your habitus, that's your class and your education and your economic environment, and whether you've had a hard life or an easy life, the music that your parents listen to and so on. So Derrida would just make us understand that what is inside of us in some way comes from the outside. So I guess often through the ear, also through the eye. Derrida writes about the eye, the primacy of given to the visual, doesn't he? Quite a lot.
Yeah.
I've always thought it was very physical, but in a really problematic way.
Absolutely, but I'm problematic in the sense of deliberately and for want of a better word, systematically destabilizing and well, to use a term that's often used and associated with a kind of a rival French philosopher, a kind of deterritorializing of those concepts. We find that undecidability of the limit of what's outside and what's inside, instantiated in all of these points. And one of the things I think I remember struggling early as an undergraduate with Derrida was, well, first the language, the difficulty, the writing, the style, I think, as much as anything. But getting it, once again, I think the metaphor is apposite. Acquiring an ear for it, and possibly acquiring an eye for it, was very much
for it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, a taste and feel.
Yeah.
what have we left out? Getting a smell for it. I don't know.
Being able to sniff it out, yeah.
The smell, the trace, that was both delightful, of a sense of just a sheer pleasure in being initiated into something, I suppose, at one level, but of quite a perhaps slightly intoxicating sense of being disoriented and not knowing and no longer being sure, as you said in your example, of my innermost thoughts, and become a kind of a disciplinary object of study for a sociologist or an ethnographer, and each of them in their own disciplinary frameworks. And I think this is an aspect of deconstruction I think I particularly learned from you, that I wasn't as attuned to that as you had been, I think, for a very long time when we first started talking about this. That disciplinary constitution of the body is something that, you know, Derrida is profoundly alive to throughout his work, and it's quite both an enjoyable and a disturbing experience when you're both grappling with the text, but also the implications of precisely that destabilization, that undecidability you were referring to.
And you use the word intoxicating. And so this is the thing that people would say about deconstruction and Derrida. They would say, oh, it kind of intoxicates, it drugs, it seduces people, and people lose their critical faculties and their sense of perspective, because deconstruction takes tiny details and then says, oh, it's the most significant thing, and pulls it to pieces. And it kind of, people would, like older, more established disciplinary perspectives and representatives of different disciplines would say, this is really not so much subversive as just over the top, like excessive. But Derrida took that idea and ran with it quite a lot. So one of the things I asked the students to read, whether they read it or not, we'll see, was that famous interview discussion called The Rhetoric of Drugs. Yeah. And that to me was a really stimulating and thought-provoking text, because it is, as with everything in Derrida, difficult. But he talks about the way in which, both philosophically and even medically, the lines between, say, the natural or and the cultural are so problematic. And at one stage he talks about like the Olympics and the Olympic ideal, the Olympic ideal of an athlete who is so super efficient and super perfect, but that's immediately menaced around the edges by, well, what are these people doing to their bodies, putting in them, injecting into them, whether it be, as Donald Trump suggests, we inject ourselves with, oh, never mind. But because
kids don't do this at home.
Let's not talk about Trump at the minute. But like, you know,
read the safety warning on packets of bleach is always the best thing to do.
The Olympic athlete is the ideal of like a national subject. But at the same time, they're also like a pharmacy, because they'll be taking everything that they legally, or in terms of the rules, can take, every vitamin supplement, tablet, everything they possibly can take. But the Olympic Committee has to go, you can't take ephedrine, you can't take aspirin, you just can't take these things. And then the Paralympics really have problematized that as well, and trans issues have thoroughly problematized it. So where am I going with this? The idea of, we're always in some sense intoxicated. So that we could be intoxicated by Derrida, we could be intoxicated by the rules of sociology, we could be intoxicated by the dream of science, right? So Derrida's argument is like, we're always intoxicated by something, and we're always kind of like a cocktail of different chemicals and different stimulants and supplements. And I mean, did you ever get that stuff? I got really excited by that stuff.
Oh, absolutely. And when I just what I think of it, your point there about the Olympic body as the epitome or the apex of the national, but also the natural at its furthest point, isn't it? And your point there is, of course, the point at which the athlete's, the supreme athlete's body is natural, is at the very limit, at the tipping point at which it is not.
Yeah.
Because in the nature of competition, in the nature of the inherent kind of discourses or practices and technologies, which is the word I'd want to introduce there, of self-improvement, of training, of optimization of every possible aspect of what you put in your body, food, supplements, as you said, legally permitted substances. And that's, as you say, crucial for Derrida, is the contingency of that line, and the way in which historically the IOC, or wherever the body is, will be, which of course is another body, as an institutional body that oversees how bodies are allowed to perform. That is always being pushed to the very limit, because at the point at which another substance is legalized or made illicit or licit is a point of advantage.
Yeah.
And so by definition, that athlete, and this is Derrida's point, isn't it, that athlete and the athlete's relationship to their body is at the most extreme point, where its relationship to the illicit and the illegal and the banned, the drug, is policed.
But I think it goes, for Derrida, it's more fundamental than that. It's not like we push a natural body to a limit and then we go, hang on, if we take that supplement, that's classed now as a steroid. For Derrida, it's at the origin. It's like he talks about the prosthesis of origin. So every origin is also, for Derrida, I guess he follows, in a sense, he just really takes that very traditional, like old kind of 19th century definition of the human as a tool-using animal, and takes it much further to say that without the tool, without the hammer or the weapon or the pencil or the piece of technology, there is no human. So the human is by definition technologically constituted. So the clothes, the everything. Yeah. But so the Olympic body, the athlete's body, is always a product of a technology, that technological
Yeah.
supplement. The
Yeah.
bodybuilder's body is technologically supplemented through diet and through disciplinary
Mm-hmm.
practices and exercise and through science. But our body, they're just an example of a body that's worked on. All bodies, the human body, has to be thought of as something produced through external technological supplements, always. So I mean, is that? But even our conceptuality and our perception.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, I think, yeah, I suppose, absolutely. That point about what I was trying to make about the extreme point of that is, it's that point itself is the undecidability of the original, the originality of prosthesis. That the although the practice, as it were, is to maintain oneself below the line is always already crossed. It's always already constitutive of the practice and already inhabited, as you say, by that technology of what is added, what is practiced, what is done with the body.
Yeah, I guess that.
Sorry, I was going to add something. It reminded me of something because I had said that I didn't really want to talk about abjection, but it's reminded me of something that I read a very long time in Bataille. It was Georges Bataille, kind of an earlier generation to Derrida, and both an influence, but also the subject of one of Derrida's early kind of examples of a kind of deconstructive reading of someone who's both influence and also a kind of a kind of marking out the kind of contradictions and the paradoxes within their position. There's this very influential idea of in Bataille of transgression that I think is influential and important for Derrida, and that for Bataille, that the act of transgression, otherwise crossing the line, is itself already a demonstration of the weakness of the prohibition. So it's inbuilt in the prohibition and the law itself to call for its transgression, which is this kind of quasi-Hegelian kind of logic that Bataille develops and Derrida himself kind of deconstructs within his essay on from restricted to a general economy, which is a writing indifference, I think.
Okay, yeah, that's
just reminded me that I think there's kind of a genealogy of these ideas, which is always interesting to bear in mind.
Yeah, I mean, that's the other thing to think about. So we too easily go, well, that's Derrida and that's Foucault and that's Deleuze and that's Lacan or Freud. But I mean, these ideas, you can't really claim ownership. You can't easily attribute an origin to the idea. So I mean, because for Derrida always, there's an interview somewhere and someone says like, what's the essence of deconstruction and what is it? And he says, if I had to say that one thing, if in a ridiculous situation, I had to say, what's the one kind of premise or the one kind of axiom or the one thing? And he says it's divisibility. Nothing is one. Nothing is not as perfectly complete in itself. You can always divide it, and it's the fact that nothing is complete means it's always proliferating. So the body isn't complete, like a process isn't complete. We count, we've got numbers, so we think there are things, but actually, it's a much more a process of ongoing elaboration. So philosophers like Deleuze get kind of the credit for this, that the idea of becoming. Being isn't a static process, it's a process of elaboration. But actually it's there in Derrida, it's there in Foucault, it's all over the place. But it's really hard, I think, for students, and not just students, I guess it's hard to, philosophically and methodologically, really hard to do anything with that. Like, what does it mean to say that there isn't one body, there isn't one identity? I always struggle with the concept of identity. People talk about blah 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 cultural identity, and I never know where that identity is. Like I've kind of got one, but it feels like it's in me, but it's not. It's a much more complex. And I haven't got one. I mean, Derrida says we haven't got identities. What we have are processes of identification and disidentification. There's no identity. That's the thing with deconstruction. There is no identity.
I think that's the other thing that fascinated me right from the very beginning, or very early on, with Derrida's work, but also the kind of writers he introduced me to. So like Foucault, like Bataille, like Blanchot, Levinas, Cizou, etc. The list goes on and on and on. Is this fundamental shift that takes place, and you're right, this is the hardest, I think, the most challenging thing, a reorientation of thinking when you're a student of this work, which obviously we both still are, in a really fundamental sense, is this shift from the assumption, and it's an ontological, philosophical one, of identity as something self-enclosed, self-present, of course, something definable and containable within a concept, to a fundamental shift towards thinking about its relationality. Yeah. And the more fundamental concept here is the one of relation, and of the multiple, plural and unstable, always becoming relations that constitute, or would we use to be able to describe what you were just articulating. Right, the very word articulation is a concept of relationality, after all.
It is. I guess that's what. And then people go, "It's all relativism," which must mean subject. And you go, "Oh God, really?" Anyway, you used the word ontological, and I guess one of the reasons that people think that deconstruction hasn't got a tremendous amount, well, two reasons, I suppose, for at least two incomplete reasons why people think
at least two,
yes, but not very good ones. No, the first one is the classic infamous formulation, "there is nothing outside the text." Therefore people think that Derrida thinks everything is just books and there's no reality, right? But that's a hideous misreading. The other one is later on in his life, when he's very clear, he's thinking about death a lot as he's getting older. He's thinking about, but people are talking, so after 1989, people are talking about the death of Marxism, the death of communism. Yeah. And so he offers the notion not of ontology, but of hauntology, which I guess sounds probably the same in French. It's another
Especially
one of the things that you have to read the word to perceive the specificity of it, because he was a big reader and a big writer. So there's nothing outside the text, and hauntology, like that, it's just ideas. That kind of gives the impression that that Derrida only thinks of words. But I think that it's much closer to the sort of Freudian psychoanalytic sense in which a symptom can be a word in the body. So at the beginning of Spectres of Marx, Derrida talks about the start of the Communist Manifesto, the line which there's a spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism. And he goes, isn't it a bit weird? Like, even before communism, Marx and Engels are saying it's already a spectre, it's a spectral, challenging idea. So, and he's like, so what does it mean to say that a spectre could be dead or a spectre could be gone? So, I mean, where am I going with this? I'm asking you to think about, or to tell me what you think about the supposed wordiness and ethereality of the concerns of Derrida, and whether that really is material or physical or embodied in any way.
I just a couple of things on that, because I think you're right. That's been one of the most productive aspects of Derrida's later work that's been spun out in a whole number of different directions. You can think about, late Mark Fisher's work, for example, who did a lot to develop hauntology and the hauntological as a kind of a concept of cultural criticism, but also within and without his work that has a long history of, as you said, in psychoanalysis, and of the kinds of very often, and this is always the wonderful thing about Derrida, because I, for the most part, have a literary background and I still teach literature. So the literary sources of Derrida's work, which are, as he states right from the very beginning, as crucial, as important, decisive as the philosophical or sociological or theological ones. So where am I going with that? Oh yes, I wanted to mention obviously your list of specular concepts and of the hauntological, because as you said, in relationship to how he introduces that concept, and remind me, does he introduce it indirectly? How explicitly does he use the term hauntological within Spectres of Marx? I can remember haunting, the spectral, the ghost. Hauntological, I'm not sure how.
I
It's been a long
actually,
time since I read it.
appropriately enough, I actually think that talk about the hauntological is more developed in subsequent like interviews and conferences and so on. So that book came out in about what, 94 or something like that.
Yeah.
I think that he was still talking about like the hauntological in works that were coming out in 2000 and so on, because he moved from talking about ghosts and specters to talking about friendship. And that was one of his last big things, wasn't it? I mean, and then he wrote a book called Monolingualism of the Other, the Prosthesis of Origin. So the idea of the supplement never went away. The idea of the supplement and the idea of the most, I guess this is when students are going to like Google Derrida deconstruction, right? They're going to come across the concept of différance, which you have to say in a French-esque accent.
Yeah.
An outrageous French accent. Of course, I am French. You silly English knigget, right? I'm quoting, of course. This is not my racism. It's not there and it's not that. So
it's the racism of the other.
Yes. So différance, right, is this misspelling of the word difference, and this is where Derrida, in the essay like La Différence, is where Derrida explicitly talks about you can't put your finger on anything. It's not there, and it's not that, and it's not yet, and it's not here. And people took that idea and went, well, then you can't do anything with this perspective because you're always apparently talking about something else that never arrives. But I think that's a misreading or incomplete reading, is it? Derrida's not saying you can't talk about things. I mean, what's he doing in La Différence, do you think? What do you think?
Well, I was going to just, I'm going to wheedle out of giving you a kind of page-by-page breakdown of his kind of challenging essay on différance, on that concept. Because I wanted to link that to literature. And because différance as a concept, as you pointed out, is a kind of a neologism of Derrida's, drawing attention to the fact that only within writing can one differentiate the word différence, meaning difference, and différence, this neologism which he uses to articulate this sense in which the deferral of meaning, the deferral of the definitive meaning, the final, you talked about ends and deaths, and that utter kind of cultural preoccupation with the ends of things from the late 80s that we kind of somehow lived through, and we're still going. That idea of the endless deferral of the definitive meaning of the final is precisely why concepts like the ineffable or what you might call the purity of absence are utterly alien to Derrida, what Derrida means by in the practice of deconstruction. That there is always the ineliminable trace that, you know, when we think we've found the source point or the exhaustion point of a phenomenon, there is always that trace of it. And this is why there's also a kind of an ethical imperative within Derrida's work, really right from the very beginning, that scholars only in the 80s were really starting to notice, is that there is that sense in which there is an obligation of memory to, as it were, recover, a bit like Walter Benjamin says about history, the kind of the rags that have been left over, the fragments, the traces, that for Derrida are there inherent in the very act of making a claim, of describing something, of describing something's disappearance. Nothing is utterly and totally gone. In the very act of writing it, one is reinscribing its memory. And the ethical obligation of that is, of course, I mean, it's some of its limit cases are things like the Shoah or the Holocaust, where as a as a project, the final solution is the aim to eradicate every last trace of European Jewry. But as Derrida himself points out on a number of occasions, and not least in his dialogue on Cinema and Its Ghosts, where he talks about Claude Lanzmann's film Shoah, it is that those traces exist even when there's no footage of what happened in those camps. The footage of witnesses speaking whilst they're doing something else. The fact that the writing of a testimony, or even the writing about the writing of a testimony, is itself the proliferation of traces, and yet it doesn't get us any closer to the thing itself. Both Derrida is both disabusing of the illusion that we can have the thing itself, that la chose même, but also disabusing of the fact that just as purely that there is some total absence, and hauntology and the spectrality that, as you said, is right there from the very earliest concepts, these quasi-transcendental concepts that he elaborates, such as difference, where the deferral of a final meaning isn't the kind of death knell of interpretation, isn't the total relativism of some kind of nihilistic project to say that, oh, nothing means anything, there's nothing outside the text, there's only texts. As you know, and as you alluded to in mentioning it, when Derrida writes, or when Derrida is translated as having written "there is nothing outside the text" in Of Grammatology, what it's translating is a French phrase, "il n'y a pas hors texte." And hors texte, as you know, is this, once again, a kind of slight conjuration of a word or of a concept, which is, I suppose, more literally translated, but inadequately translated as "there is no outside text. There is no final context." Mm-hmm. There is always an interpretation of interpretation. There's always a text about the text. Even when that text we claim to be economic reality or politics or history, those framing texts are themselves discourses, historical in origin, with their own contingencies, their own institutions, traditions, and disciplinary habits. Mm. And so we are never at the point of, for want of a better term, that total knowledge, the Hegel's kind of mythical notion of absolute knowing at the end of the phenomenology of spirit. God, that went a long way, didn't it? I managed to squeeze in the obligatory reference to the Holocaust. I don't know how I managed to do that.
Yeah.
Literature. Can I bring that back to literature, if you'll indulge me?
Yeah.
My gambit would be is that literature is more important to Derrida than almost anything else. But that's partly a disciplinary prejudice on my part. But almost is my get out, perhaps, as we might say. Because where we encounter, not the exemplary case, but where we encounter a kind of an immensely powerful and everyday experience of the spectral, of the hauntological, is in the act of reading, not just a literary text, any text, just reading. Because the text, the information transmitted through the act of reading, these abstract shapes on a page, in whichever form, language, or system of language that we're operating within, mark the entry into a kind of speculative world, a world that is not the world.
Yeah, I agree with that, but I would take it out of literature again, which is probably my prejudice or my bias, and I think that I would tend to say that in many ways Derrida uses the acts of writing and reading, but really reading, the act of reading, as a kind of metaphor or meta paradigm that is relevant to the interpretation of anything, even the phenomenological, even the embodied, even the experience, because for lots of reasons, and it's to do with the impossibility of repetition. And it's to do with so when Derrida died in like 2004 or whenever it was, so 2003, 2004 something. When was it?
Cool. Yeah.
2004. The best obituary that I read was one by Derek Attridge, and it was in the Observer or the Guardian, something. And he said that as a young academic, Derrida's first role in the French university was to be a répétiteur, and that is someone who literally just repeats, teaches students like drill, like chapter and verse, Plato this, Aristotle this. And apparently when Derrida did this, he was consistently surprised and delighted at the fact that in every different class, when all he had to do was repeat the lesson of Plato, the lesson of Rousseau, the lesson of whoever, they always came to a slightly different interpretation of it. Yeah. And so that got Derrida thinking about, well, there is no possibility of a pure repetition. There's only a reiteration. And then he looks at the etymology of the idea of iteration, and it's about introduction of the other. Yeah. And people, and that this is always, on the one hand, like, I'm a text to you, you're a text to me. When I look at you and I try to work out whether you're happy, sad, having a good time, what you're arguing, it's the same as reading a book, complicated book, like a work of modernist literature or a poem or something, trying to work out what is going on. And vice versa. But I'm also a text to me, so I read myself and go, why do I feel like this? Why do I want to wear these clothes? Why do I want to do that? And so everything is literary and interpretive in that way. But every reading is also a rewriting, and this also relates to the physical. So like, nothing that you do physically is ever the same, even if it's the most habituated thing that you do. It's always slightly different. And the act of repeating it adds something else. So people would say, well, Derrida teaches us nothing about the body, but I would say, hang on a second. If I'm a martial artist, right, and I'm learning how, or I'm playing tennis, or I'm learning how to do this move, or I'm learning something like this, every single time I do it, it is different, and I become different in terms of what I can do and in terms of the way that I do it. So I think that Derrida takes the literary and makes it and pushes it out as a kind of like a master paradigm for everything. And he wants to say literature's better than philosophy, literature's better than social science, literature's better than, because they were really big disciplinary wars. I mean, he was fighting other academics.
Yeah. I think it would be a mistake to think we've got past those wars and those boundaries and borders, which are being re-established in different ways right to the present time. But I think it's absolutely spot on. I love the idea that one way of putting this would be to say, well, actually, literature is as legitimate a source for the production of concepts as any other discipline or any other cultural phenomenon. And I think you're absolutely right to say, well, actually, if that applies to literature, it can apply to anything. It can apply to martial arts. It can apply to cinema. It can apply to badminton. It's no insult to badmintoners.
Yeah, no. I mean, there's so many things that that can be thought there, but a lot of people think that deconstruction has nothing to do with the body. Deconstruction denies the body. It denies face-to-face, real-time presence. But I think that what it does is it enriches these concepts. So a phrase of deconstruction that wasn't really Derrida's phrase, but it was developed by post-structuralist thinkers around him, would be to talk about a condition of possibility for something that is also, and by the same token, the condition of its impossibility. So the very fact that if I read a book, if I read an argument, or if I read a poem or something like that today, and then I go back and read it tomorrow or next week, it will be something different. It just will be, like, or I could have written a really angry letter or a diary entry when I was 12 about how much I hated my dad, and I can go back and read that and go, oh my god, that's some kind of weird Oedipus complex, and I could read it on my deathbed and go, that child, and it's just different every time because I'm different, because there's always just difference. So where am I going with that?
Can I give you a really good...
The condition of possibility, it's the condition of possibility that the inevitability of a different interpretation means that a final interpretation is impossible. But that's not nihilistic. it's productive.
Well, also, and I will want to link that back to my point about the ethical dimension of deconstruction, which I think is really, as well as its political dimension, which is really important. And I think this relates to the body, as in terms of the body as it's often classified within a kind of Western metaphysical tradition as somehow other, as somehow, you know, its identification with otherness and with the other from the mind, from spirit, etc. And that is one of Derrida's ways, and I think this might be the Derrida's formulation, as you said, you know, one of the ways in which he's subsequently been interpreted in a kind of a shorthand way of referring to his way of approaching any object or topic or discourse. But it's this idea that there is, it's the always other interpretation. It's that iterability is the constitutive instability of the text, the phenomenon, whatever it might be, insofar as in this case we're using text in this expanded sense of everything that is an object of interpretation, that is something that is read or interpreted or laid claim to or attached to or loved or hated or whatever it might be. These are all attachments or relations that we can think about, not in a reductive way of just reducing them to a text, but trying to think about their richness, their contested nature, that we might, as you said right at the very beginning, we might have quite different interpretations of a particular practice, a phenomenon, an event, or something we both witness. And the idea, I suppose, here, in terms of the ethical dimension, is that Derrida is also writing in such a way, and this is one of the things I think it puzzled me, and I confess it's infuriated me at times when I've really gone to a text by Derrida to say, really, what does he say about this? What can I use? You know,
yeah.
That desire to have something useful and take that appalling discourse that transcends or emerges out of the world of business and is already part of education. Perhaps it went the other way, I don't know, but it's something that we share as a kind of a monstrosity, which is this idea, the takeaway point.
Mm-hmm.
What are your takeaways from this event, Paul?
The key learnings.
Key learnings. Is that the extractability of some kind of pure product is withheld from us by Derrida consistently and strategically, and I would argue, and not me arguing this is others, that some people like John Mowat have argued very persuasively. There's an ethical and political dimension to this, because there is an endeavor here, as soon as one makes the claim that the definitive, final, pure meaning never arrives, that there are always other interpretations, and that this is not nihilistic relativism, but rather a responsible relation to the always other, and other as excluded, not yet heard, marginalized, silenced,
I think
reading or perspective.
Yeah, I like that. I like the sense that deconstruction involves what they used to call a principled ethical openness to alterity. Like you list in this being dominant, what has been marginalized, in this being dominant, what has been silenced, and what is excluded from this dominant or from this norm or from these parameters in which this is good and this is right and this is wrong. But it's interesting that I also want to talk about mind-body dualism, but you said that you don't like key learnings and key takeaways, and but that you worry that there's something from the business world that has kind of infected us somehow. Now, when Ray Chow writes about the post-structuralists, she's writing specifically about Foucault, but she's also talking about Roland Barthes and Jacques Derrida and other figures. She argues that when they were young, and one thing they really hated was instrumental business language. They worried about science, but they hated commerce, and they hated the commercialization of everything. Okay. And what they loved was high modernist literature. Sorry, there's a World War III breaking out here. And so, in a sense, that post-structuralism is complicated for principled reasons. It's complicated so that it won't be the language of non-literature, the language of capitalism, commerce, and trade. And so, like, that's the reason Derrida's so complicated. Like, he's deliberately complicated, not really for an ethical openness to alterity, but because he hates simplified language. He hates business. You think?
Oh, I was going to say, I always thought it was slightly more undecidable than that. I wasn't sure whether it came from business or came from us in the first place and just got returned to us in a form that we didn't like. Because key learning points, that's a basic of all pedagogical procedures and protocols that one makes, the digested summary, and there is a logic to that is both necessary, useful, practical, pragmatic, and at the same time necessarily, and it's all of those things because it is reductive.
Yeah.
And I think I like Ray Chow's work for a whole number of reasons, but I think in particular because she, and I'm trying to think about someone else who might do a similar thing. There is a really interesting reinscription of that post-structuralist tradition into its conditions, its own conditions of emergence. The culture of Kristen Ross is the other person I'm thinking about, who's tying together this, I suppose what we might call a kind of social material history of the emergence of something like post-structuralism or deconstruction.
Yeah, I think what I want to end on, more or less, is I want to ask you about the deconstruction of any kind of mind-body dualism. And the reason I want to do this is because I started one lecture when we still could have lectures in the good old days, by talking about the sort of the mind body. I talked a little bit about Descartes, and we watched some stuff about Descartes, and we talked about, you know, the cogito, I think, therefore I am. But really I was doing this to stage, to begin a discussion about the way in which man, like actually men, get associated with the idea of the mind and the brain and logos and thinking and rational, and whereas women and slaves and so on historically have been associated more with the body and the materiality. But some of the students have really got into the mind-body dualism thing. Okay. And I've been saying, no, let's not do this, let's not do that, because that's basically a philosophy course. But I think that a lot of them are really, really interested in the idea of the mind-body dualism. I mean, what would you say deconstruction is most helpful with in this regard? I mean, what does Derrida do to any kind of mind-body dualism or any kind of duality like that?
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Because I think on a certain kind of training and philosophical tradition and trajectory, you know, the mind-body dualism appears at times almost like a kind of a ghost from the past. It's something that, you know, on certain philosophy, I mean, a phenomenological tradition, a tradition of thinking that we can trace back from a kind of from Kant through phenomenological thinkers like Husserl, Heidegger, and then in France, Merleau-Ponty. They have sought to not just reject, but simply just break down. And, you know, once again, some of the precursors of deconstruction that Derrida himself would point to would be the kinds of work by Heidegger and other phenomenologists in precisely questioning, deconstructing that division of the clean division between mind and body. And yet it's still with us. It still sticks with us as a let's face it, a profoundly useful conceptual tool for trying to understand a whole number of different problems or questions. Where Derrida might take us in terms of thinking about the mind-body as dualism is, I suppose, in the one sense, why just those two?
Yeah.
Why a mind and a body? Coming back to your point about iterability and plurality, that there is always one, there's always more than one mind and always more than one body.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, and comes back to a couple of points we've made earlier in terms of other minds and other bodies. One of the kind of breaking points in that phenomenological tradition, I think, historically in the 20th century at least, coming through Husserl's Cartesian meditations. And of course, Cartesian meditations refers us back to, because they are explicitly an attempt to, if you like, read and rewrite and deconstruct on the part of Edmund Husserl, the grounding, one of the grounding texts of modern philosophy. So Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy from the mid-17th century, 1644, I think. And the fifth meditation is the most famous of Husserl's, and not necessarily of Descartes', because it's the one where Descartes struggles to deal with the division that he hasn't created, but he's used to ground his distinction of truth, of belief and reality. And the kind of epistemological grounding point is the fact that, as you said earlier, alongside the kind of gendered split of mind and body, we can add truth and falsity. We can add the mind as the instrument or the faculty of discerning the truth, and the body is the thing that deceives us. This is what Descartes worried about, was that my senses deceive me, because deep down he was he had a very mechanical and materialist conception of the body. You know, electromagnetic signals were being interpreted by a brain. There had to be something else, he said, commanding or steering this ship, is the metaphor. For Husserl, the problem that emerges here is the one of other minds. You know, how can I, in coming to know myself and know my own mind, know the mind of the other, when it's precisely this embodied other that I encounter? And here we are, you know, in this dialogue or conversation, trying to kind of improvise our understanding of what the other is thinking, and our bodies are in some way crucial to that. You know, I'm reading your body language, your gestures, as you're patiently waiting to say what you're going to say, and I'm not letting you because I just keep talking. And so we whilst the mind-body distinction is utterly unsatisfactory to get us to understand the complexity of what's going on, what's happening, we make those distinctions, we draw on them daily as as you said, as another kind of paradigm for understanding. And for Derrida, we don't do away with that. We can't just reject it. We can't just forget that those concepts are already part of the vocabulary that we're using. I'll shut up.
But we have to invert and displace. I really like the point about the idea that a deconstruction would kind of go, but why one mind and why one body? Because it's, I guess, if you want to try and do a deconstruction, or you want to be analyzing something from a deconstructive kind of perspective, the first thing you want to identify is a binary, because it's going to be problematic, because it presumes there's one thing on each side of the diagonal line, but there's not, because I mean a lot of kind of psychoanalytic type work has associated the mind very much with your skin and whatever you're perceiving on your skin. There's a book called Skin Ego, which is like, it's what you're touching. That's really essentially where your consciousness and your mind is in different ways. So, you know, why only one mind? Why would there be? Because just because we think that your mind must be in your brain and your body is like, you could somehow like, you could take your brain and put it in a jar and be like the man with two brains or whatever. But that's not even a scientifically valid concept. It's just a kind of very casual, colloquial kind of folkish sort of set of terms. But someone like Derrida would just instantly problematize the binary, or should, if you're going to do some kind of deconstruction, problematize the binary, show how it can't possibly be one thing, and then start pulling it to pieces from there and displacing the debate onto other matters. We've been talking for like 55 minutes. Wow. I think that we should knock it on the head, so to speak. Knock it on the head, knock it on the body. Is that all right?
That's perfectly acceptable. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you very much, Richard.
Thank you, Paul. Been great fun.
Yeah, thanks a lot.